Hello again, internet friends. Today I want to talk to you about a subject that is very near and dear to my heart. And because it's so near and dear to my heart, this is going to be probably take 12 of this video because it's difficult for me not to get off on a tangent and start ranting. So I'm going to try my best to keep this short and sweet so that you can take some action items into the gym with you and hopefully make your training safer, healthier, and more effective. It's important to remember that when we're talking about big, broad subjects like this, pain management, injury prevention, these things are very complicated. There's lots of moving parts that cause them and prevent them, and everybody's circumstance is going to be a little bit different. So what I talk about in this video will simply be what I have learned from my experience, what has worked for me, what has worked for my online athletes, and I'm just trying to maybe suggest a new way of looking at pain management, and injury prevention. I'm not necessarily trying to tell you one thing or another is wrong, although I may hint at that throughout the video. I just want this video to kind of be an invitation to look at things differently than you may have in the past. So to give you some context, the first couple of years that I was coaching, I had a very mechanical way of looking at the body. And I had learned this from a bunch of different places, and that was kind of the popular way to look at the body at the time, or at least from what I had seen. And you've probably heard and seen some of these things before, but if you had pain or injury or some type of problem, something wasn't going well, somebody would say something to you like, oh, well, this muscle group isn't activating properly, or this muscle is too tight, or this joint doesn't have enough mobility in this direction, or we need your hip capsule to be able to rotate this way, or oh, your spine's out of alignment. Those are the types of things I would hear when I would go to the internet to try and find answers there, or to a physical therapist or a doctor of sports medicine of some kind. And so I spent a lot of time trying to adhere to that advice and adhere to those lines of thinking, trying to get certain muscles to activate the correct way with some sort of corrective exercise, or doing some sort of movement that was supposed to help my hips get back into their natural alignment. And none of those things worked. I continued to have the same issue. I continued to feel the same and kind of have the same symptoms. Nothing really seemed to be working. Nothing allowed me to get back to training the way I wanted to train. And so I just continued to look, trying to find out what was going on. Why was I continuing to hurt myself? And after several years of trying, I finally ran into a guy named John Flagg, who on Instagram is Rebuild Stronger Online, and I will link his Instagram profile below. And he introduced me to a number of ideas, which totally changed the way I look at pain management, and injury prevention. And that is the kind of outlook that I take into my training and that I use with my online athletes today. And that set of ideas that I learned, kind of like I talked about before, it's not a simple thing. The problem is not simple. There's a lot of moving parts, and the answer is also not necessarily simple. There's also a lot of moving parts. But I think the easiest way to sum it up, or at least to get you on the path and going in that right direction, is to discuss the idea of tissue tolerance. And we'll talk about tissue tolerance within the context of three factors: load, volume, and range of motion. And so that's the amount of weight that you have on the bar, the number of reps and sets that you're doing in a workout or over the course of a week, and the range of motion that you're using in different exercises. When wanting to understand this idea of tissue tolerance fully, there are other factors that are involved, but just for the sake of simplicity and the shortness of the video, we'll just talk about those three. And when we're talking about this, it's conceptually very simple, but when you try and apply it in the gym, it can become difficult, and there's a lot of moving parts that have to be managed at the same time. And so it's easy for somebody who's not as experienced to get lost and not really know what to do. And so to put it as simply as possible, when we are talking about fitness and lifting weights and running and martial arts and that type of stuff, the majority of the time, not all the time, but I think the majority of the time, when somebody is experiencing pain or injury, whether it's major or minor, it is a simple issue of the tissue that is in pain or that is injured was not able to withstand the stress that was put upon it. That can be muscle tissue, it can be tendon or ligament tissue, it can even be bone tissue. But obviously, for our purposes, we are for the most part discussing muscle and tendon tissue. And so I'll give you an example that I encountered very recently that hopefully will help you make sense of all the stuff I've been saying up till now. I have an athlete that I work with who is normally a high bar squatter. He's high bar squatted for years and years, and we just within the past maybe 6 months or so switched to consistently low bar squatting. And so one day he came to me and said, "Hey, my shoulders are hurting pretty bad. What do we do?" And at the same time he was talking to me, he was also talking with a physical therapist, trying to approach the pain from every angle so that we could get it resolved as quickly as possible. And so he shared with me kind of the PT's diagnosis, and I cannot remember the exact word. It's a long, fancy medical term, but essentially he was under the impression that the problem was some type of degenerative bone disorder. And there were a couple other issues that he mentioned, but this was obviously a big and glaring one. And so I briefly read up on the medical diagnosis and things like that to familiarize myself with it. But as I've said in many previous videos, I am not a doctor, so I was basically reading the Wikipedia page on it. And we knew that he did not have a history of any type of bone disorder issues or anything like that. No major serious health conditions that may have led to this or contributed to this. So there wasn't really any reason for us to jump to such a catastrophic conclusion right away. Let's look at some of the more obvious culprits first. The first thing I looked at was bench press, because we were in a very heavy phase of training and we were training bench press heavy twice a week. And so I said, okay, maybe the bench press is what's bugging it. And then second on the list was the low bar squat. Like I said before, he had historically been a high bar squatter and he had just recently switched to low bar squatting. And this was the first time that he had gone through a very heavy peaking phase with a low bar position. And so with the low bar position, the bar is lower on the back, and by necessity, the shoulders are jammed farther back to accommodate that lower bar position. And so that does put a new and added strain on the shoulders and a new and added need for the shoulders to have a longer range of motion. And so the first thing we want to do is get that pain to a manageable level. And so he started out, when he initially talked to me, with about a 7 out of 10 pain level, which is pretty bad. And so right away, I went and adjusted the two major sources of fatigue on the shoulder that we were inducing during training, and that was heavy bench pressing and the low bar squat. And so I said, let's take a bunch of weight off the bench press and have you bench press still, so that we're not just taking time off, but bench press at an intensity level where the pain is closer to a 2 out of 10 rather than a 7 out of 10. And because he was experiencing a lot of the pain while he was low bar squatting, I said, okay, let's take the weight off the bar. If need be, we can move the bar up your back a little bit more so that it's closer to a high bar position and not so much of a strain on the shoulders. In addition to those things, I believe he also mentioned that his shoulders would feel okay before he squatted, but then they would really start bugging him after he squatted. And so that's kind of another indicator that, hey, maybe jamming his shoulders back and down into that low bar position is really what's bothering them. So instead of saying, oh, that position's bad for you, don't do that, we need to prep the body so that it's more ready to get into that position and more able to get into that position. So we went and did some behind the neck presses, very, very light, 10, 15, 20 pounds for a couple reps and a couple sets, just to get it warm, just to start to build up the shoulders' ability to go in that behind the back range of motion. And we did that as a warm up to him squatting. Okay, so at this point, let's take a step back and review what we've gone over. The shoulders are hurting pretty severely, so we're going to look at all the stressors that are being put on the shoulder and ask ourselves, what is the shoulder not prepared to handle? What is causing this pain? And we were pretty confident that it wasn't the bench press, because he had been benching heavy twice a week for many years. And so that was most likely not the source. But if the shoulder's sensitive and you're still benching heavy, it's probably going to contribute to it. So let's take some weight off the bar. And we know you're relatively new to low bar squatting, so what can we do to address that? One, we can do those behind the neck presses because it almost exactly replicates the position that his shoulder is going to need to get into, and it's going to help him not only warm up and feel better, but it's also going to help him build the range of motion in his shoulders and get strong through that new range of motion so that he can better handle the low bar squat itself. And if that doesn't work out, we'll keep the high bar squat kind of in our back pocket, because if a week or two goes by and we're not seeing a little bit of improvement at least in the shoulder pain, then we need to take more drastic measures so that we don't continue to aggravate the area. And so if all this doesn't work out, we're going to move back to high bar squat so that at the very least we can still get the awesome strength stimulus that the squat movement offers and not irritate the shoulders and potentially hurt them even more. So ultimately, the behind the neck press warm-up proved to be a really, really effective tool in helping to reduce and eventually get rid of that shoulder pain completely. I think that lowering the weight on the bar with the bench press was also a factor. Probably not the main one though. I think it was the low bar squatting position that was just beating up his shoulders, and he really just didn't feel good doing those. But with the implementation of that behind the neck press warm-up, the week after that, he went from a 7 out of 10 to probably a 3 or a 4 out of 10 on the pain scale. And then the week after that, it was anywhere from 2 to 0 on the pain scale, depending on what day I asked him. And so hopefully you can see how this example fits with what I talked about earlier as far as tissue tolerance with range of motion, load, and training volume. And that when we experience pain and even injury, a lot of the time it's because we're inducing a stress and a stimulus on the body that it's simply not prepared to handle. And so in this case, the shoulder hurt. We didn't know exactly what the problem was. And so he said, okay, let's take a little bit of weight off the bar so that that's less stress there. We've introduced a new range of motion, so let's help you more gradually get into that range of motion with a more complete warm-up. At the same time, that warm-up of the behind the neck press is going to help you get used to that range of motion so that your body can handle the stress and the demand of that lower bar position and the increased shoulder flexibility and range of motion that's required of it. And once we addressed both those variables, in a relatively short amount of time, he went from a 7 out of 10 on the pain scale in his shoulders, and we weren't sure if he was going to be able to low bar squat anymore, to 3 or 4 weeks later, 0 pain in the bench press, 0 pain in the squat, and hey, everything's going great. And it's because we looked at the body through the lens of tissue tolerance. What demands are being placed upon my body, and is my body ready to handle those demands? And if the answer is no, you have to start asking, what do I need to do to scale this workout or scale this movement back so that it's more manageable for me and so that I can still make progress towards whatever I'm trying to achieve, but not causing pain and eventually risking an injury. Okay, well, as per usual, I have gone way too long in the video, so we're going to end it here. For all 3 of you who have made it this long in the video, thank you very much. If you have suggestions or questions that you'd like to see addressed in future videos, please let me know in the comments below. I'm always looking for something that's relevant to you guys. If you have a question about your specific circumstance, don't be afraid to message me on Instagram. I reply to pretty much all my messages. And in the next video, you can look forward to something much shorter. Thanks for listening, and I will see you then.